Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the gilded halls of Versailles in 1770, where a trembling 14-year-old Austrian archduchess is about to discover that her primary value to the French crown isn't her charm, her intelligence, or her diplomatic skills. It's who's her uterus. Picture this. Marie Antoinette, barely out of childhood, stands in her ornate wedding gown while French court physicians conduct what can only be described as a fertility inspection, examining her hips, her posture, and her general reproductive potential like livestock at market. The marriage contract between Austria and France wasn't just a political alliance. It was essentially a breeding agreement with very specific terms and expectations. So if you're into strange and fascinating tales from history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Marie Antoinette's transformation from Austrian archduchess to French baby-making machine began the moment her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, signed the marriage treaty that would seal the alliance between two of Europe's most powerful dynasties. The Habsburg-Bourbon union required more than just symbolic gestures. They demanded biological proof of its success in the form of healthy French heirs who could claim both Austrian and French royal blood. Maria Theresa had spent years preparing her daughter, not for queenship in any traditional sense, but specifically for the role of royal broodmare. The empress hired French tutors who taught Marie Antoinette not just language and etiquette, but detailed lessons about French royal birthing customs, the politics of royal pregnancies, and the ceremonial requirements surrounding royal reproduction. Even before leaving Austria, Marie Antoinette underwent medical examinations by court physicians who certified her fertility potential and provided detailed reports to the French court about her menstrual cycles, her physical development, and her likely reproduction. These medical assessments, preserved in both Austrian and French court archives, read more like veterinary records than royal medical records. To the regulatory, the journey from Vienna to Versailles included scheduled stops where French court representatives continued these fertility assessments, ensuring that their future queen remained in optimal reproductive condition. During the lengthy trip across Europe, Marie Antoinette's wedding night wasn't just a private moment between newlyweds. It was a state event, monitored by court, had been properly consummated, and that pregnancy was therefore possible. The tradition of royal bedding ceremonies meant that high-ranking nobles literally witnessed the couple's first night together, ostensibly to ensure the legitimacy of any future heirs, but really to guarantee that the breeding process had officially begun. Within weeks of her arrival at Versailles, Marie Antoinette discovered that her daily schedule was no longer her own. Every aspect of her routine was now organized around reproducing her fertility. Court physicians began tracking her menstrual cycles with the precision of modern fertility specialists, maintaining detailed charts that were regularly reviewed by both French and Austrian ambassadors, who reported on the Queen's reproductive progress to their respective governments. The pressure to produce an heir wasn't just personal, it was international, with the stability of the Franco-Austrian alliance literally dependent on Marie Antoinette's ability for crowns. Scholars continue to debate whether Marie Antoinette fully understood the extent to which her value as queen was tied exclusively to her reproductive capacity, or whether she initially believed she would have other meaningful roles in French governance. Her letters home to her mother during these early months reveal a young woman who was gradually realizing that her education, her opinions, and her personality were largely irrelevant. The Austrian princess, who had been raised to appreciate music, art, and intellectual conversation, found herself instead surrounded by physicians, midwives, and court officials whose primary interest was the contents of her womb rather than the contents of her mind. Marie Antoinette's daily routine at Versailles quickly evolved into what can only be described as a scientifically managed breeding program, with every meal, every activity, and every social and daily act. Court nutritionists developed special diets designed to optimize her reproductive health, while court physicians prescribed specific exercises, sleeping positions, and even sexual positions that were believed to increase the likelihood of conception. The young queen found herself living according to a schedule that prioritized her biological functions over her personal preferences, with meal times, sleep schedules, and even recregnant. Her Austrian attendants were gradually replaced with French courtiers, who were specifically chosen for their expertise in royal reproduction, rather than their ability to provide companionship or emotional support to a homesick teenager. The transformation was complete within her first year at Versailles. Marie Antoinette had evolved from a spirited Austrian archduchess into what the French court essentially viewed as a walking incubator for future Bourbon heirs. Yet even as she adapted to this new reality, Marie Antoinette maintained the kind of naive optimism that suggested she still believed pregnancy would bring her closer to acceptance and perhaps even affection from her new subjects. She had no way of knowing that her role as France's designated baby machine would ultimately become both her greatest source of political power and the primary weapon her enemies would use to destroy her. The machinery of royal reproduction at Versailles operated with the precision of a Swiss timepiece, and Marie Antoinette found herself at the center of an elaborate system designed to transform her body into a reliable producer of Bourbon heirs. Dr. Germain Pichot de la Martinière, the Queen's personal physician, maintained what he called the royal fertility calendar. Each morning began with what court records euphemistically termed the Queen's constitutional examination, during which Dr. Martinière recorded her temperature, examined her complexions for signs of pregnancy, and asked detailed questions about her fidancencies. Madame de Saint-Maidel Confessor, Blush the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, were trained to observe and report on everything from changes in her apnea. Marie Antoinette's menstrual cycles became matters of international diplomatic importance, with French ambassadors regularly updating foreign courts about the timing of her periods and the likelihood of pregnancy in any given month. The Austrian ambassador, Count Mercy Argenteau, maintained a separate correspondence with Empress Maria Theresa. The precluded monthly fertility reports with Empress Maria Theresa. Court protocol dictated that Marie Antoinette's sexual relations with Louis Fingy follow a carefully calculated schedule designed to coincide with her most fertile periods, turning their intimate life into a choreographed performance managed by medical professionals rather than personal desire. Dr. Martinière consulted with leading fertility experts across Europe, incorporating theories about lunar cycles. The meals served to Marie Antoinette were carefully designed according to 18th century fertility science, with specific emphasis on foods believed to enhance conception, pune, regular servings of oysters, figs, and various herbal preparations that modern science has since proven completely rejected. Her daily routine included mandatory rest periods, during which she was required to lie in spadidic positions. The court fissure was required to lie in spadici positions. Tranquil passive have. The Queen's wardrobe was modified to accommodate what her dressmakers called reproductive considerations, with corsets designed to avoid any pressure on her abdomen, and gowns cut to allow for rapid alteration in case of pregnancy. Marie Antoinette's exercise regimen was carefully controlled by court physicians who prescribed specific activity believed to enhance fertility while prohibiting abortion. Even her entertainment was regulated according to reproductive science, with court physicians recommending cheerful musical performances and prohibiting tragic operas that might create emotional distress potentially harmful to her fertility. The pressure extended beyond mere medical management to include what can only be described as reproductive management. Various court factions monitoring management. Ladies-in-waiting were expected to note and report on everything from the frequency of royal sexual encounters to the Queen's emotional state following intimate moments with the King, creating detailed records that were reviewed by both medical advisors and political counselors. Scholars debate whether this level of reproductive surveillance represented standard royal protocol or whether Marie Antoinette faced undue. The mechanical nature of royal reproduction extended to the timing of conception attempts, with court officials scheduling intimate encounters between the King and Queen according to calculated fertility windows, romantic inclination, or personal desire. Marie Antoinette's private chambers were modified to include what court records describe as conception, arranged to court record chambers, conceptions, mount canordis, to pray to chambers. Dr. Martinière maintained correspondence with fertility specialists in Vienna, London, and Rome, creating an international network of medical advisors, all focused on the singular goal of getting the French Queen pregnant as quickly and reliably as possible. The Queen's daily schedule included mandatory consultations with court midwives who examined her for signs of pregnancy, tracked her physically, and hempsing treatments. These treatments ranged from herbal tonics and mineral baths to more invasive procedures that modern medical ethics would consider inappropriate, all administered in service of maximizing Marie Antoinette's reproductive potential. The court maintained detailed records of every aspect of these fertility treatments, creating archives. Marie Antoinette's correspondence with her mother reveals a young woman struggling to maintain personal autonomy while living under constant medical supervision designed to optimize her biological function rather than her emotional well-being. The Queen's attempts to modify or resist aspects of her medically managed routine were met with firm intervention from court officials, who reminded her that her primary duty to France required absolute compliance with reproductive protocols. Even her social interactions were regulated according to fertility considerations, with court physicians recommending specific types of conversation and prohibiting others that might create stress potentially harmful to conception. The result was a daily existence that resembled a carefully controlled, scientific experiment more than royal life, with Marie Antoinette serving as both the subject and the primary stakeholder in an elaborate system designed to produce French heirs. With miscarriages subtly, this transformation of royal reproduction into a managed medical process would prove prophetic, as Marie Antoinette's body became not just a vehicle for producing heirs, but a symbol of royal excess and foreign influence that her enemies would eventually use to justify revolution. Yet, in those early years at Versailles, surrounded by physicians, Marie Antoinette still believed that successful pregnancy would earn her the acceptance and affection of her eyes. So radio, she had yet to discover that being France's most efficiently managed baby machine would ultimately make her its most hated queen. The first miscarriage arrived like a thunderclap in the spring of 1774, shattering the carefully constructed illusion that royal reproduction could be managed like clockwork and revealing the devastating human cost of treating a queen's body as state property. Marie Antoinette had been pregnant for 3 months when the bleeding began during a routine morning examination, transforming Dr. Martier's fertility calendar from a symbol of scientific precision that sent shockwaves through both the French court and international category. The Queen's anguished cries echoed through the corridors of Versailles as court physicians worked frantically to save a pregnancy that represented not just personal loss, but political catastrophe. With the Franco-Austrian alliance, within hours of the miscarriage, coded messages were dispatched to Vienna, informing Empress Maria Theresa that her daughter's reproductions maturaza, that her careful schedules with the court's response to Marie Antoinette's pregnancy loss revealed the extent to which her personal tragedy was viewed primarily as a diplomatic crisis, rather than human suffering requiring compassion and recovery time. Dr. Martier immediately began conducting what he termed failure analysis, examining every aspect of the Queen's routine during the lost pregnancy to identify factors that might have contributed to the miscarriage. The Queen's diet, exercise regimen, sleeping positions, and even her choice of reading material during the failed pregnancy was scrutinized with forensic intensity, as if Marie Antoinette's miscarriage resulted from inadequate attention to scientific fertility reproductive. Health court midwives were brought in to examine the remains of the lost pregnancy, searching for clues about genetic abnormalities or developmental problems that might indicate broader issues with the Queen's reproductive capacity. Marie Antoinette's emotional devastation following the miscarriage was treated as a secondary concern compared to the immediate need to resume the reproductive schedule and attempt another pregnancy as quickly as medically advisable. Her letters to her mother during this period reveal a young woman grappling not just with personal grief, but with the terrifying realization that her value depended on her ability to successfully. The second miscarriage occurred in early 1776, after another carefully managed pregnancy that followed revised medical protocols designed to address the supposed deficiencies identified in the first reproductive failure. This time, the loss occurred in the 5th month, far enough along that the Queen had begun to show and court preparations for a royal birth had already commenced, making the miscarriage a public spectacle rather than a private tragedy. Marie Antoinette's public appearances following the second pregnancy loss were orchestrated to project confidence in her continued fertility, while privately, court physicians were beginning to question whether the Queen's reproductive system was fundamentally to debate whether Marie Antoinette's miscarriages resulted from the intense stress of constant marriages of Habsburg gen breeding, or simply the statistical reality that pregnancy loss was common in an era before modern obstetric care. The third miscarriage in 1777 prompted what court records describe as a comprehensive reproductive review involving consultations with fertility experts from across Europe, who were invited to examine the Queen and recommend modifications. These specialists subjected Marie Antoinette to increasingly invasive inseminations and experiment. The Queen's personal chambers were transformed into something resembling a medical laboratory, with equipment for fertility treatments, examination tables, and collections of herbal preparations that filled the air with the acrid smell of failed scientific ambitions. Marie Antoinette's daily routine became even more regimented, following the series of miscarriages, with court physicians implementing what they called enhanced fertility protocols. The Antoinette's bore ili rouge de carriages, with court for more regiment. Her correspondence during this period reveals a woman who had begun to view her own body as an enemy that refused to cooperate with royal duty, expressing shame and self-blame for reproductive failures that were entirely beyond her control. The psychological toll of repeated pregnancy losses, combined with the relentless menace à papier, Marie Antoinette developed what modern medicine would recognize as anxiety-related digestive problems, sleep disorders, and chronic fatigue, all of which her 18th century doctors attributed to uterine dysfunction and treated with increasingly aggressive interventions. The Queen's attempts to find emotional support were complicated by the fact that her ladies-in-waiting were primarily selected for their ability to monitor. Even her relationship with Louis Fismines became strained by the medical management of their intimate life with court physicians, scheduling their sexual encounters according to fertility calculations rather than personal desire or emotional connection. The fourth miscarriage in 1778 occurred during the 6th month of pregnancy, resulting in a stillbirth that was developed enough to reveal the gender. This loss was particularly devastating because it proved that Marie Antoinette was capable of conceiving male heirs, making the stillbirth feel like a cruel joke played by biology on the carefully constructed reproductive machinery of Versailles. The court's response to the stillborn prince included elaborate funeral arrangements that served more as political theatre than genuine mourning, with the tiny coffin displayed in ways designed to empty. Marie Antoinette's recovery from this fourth pregnancy loss was complicated by court physicians who insisted on conducting detailed examinations of her body to determine why she was unable to successfully deliver the heirs that France so desperately needed. The Queen found herself trapped in a nightmare cycle of pregnancy, loss, medical intervention, and renewed attempts at conception that had transformed her from a spirited young woman into what she privately described as a broken machine that refuses to work properly. Yet, even as Marie Antoinette endured repeated reproductive failures under the most intense medical supervision in royal history, she continued to believe that eventual success would justify the suffering and restore her value in the eyes of her adopted country. She had no way of knowing that her struggles with pregnancy would soon become fodder for a philothetic fregata, suffering reproductive tragedy into a symbol of royal excess and foreign corruption. The pamphlets began appearing in the streets of Paris like a plague of paper wasps, each one more venomous than the last, transforming Marie Antoinette's reproductive struggles from private medical tragedy into public political ammunition that would ultimately help bring down the French monarchy. Offered the perfect metaphor or everything they despised about royal excess, foreign influences, and the aristocratic effort that the Queen's body off the Barren. The Austrian horse Barren became one of the most widely circulated pamphlets of 1780, featuring graphic illustrations that depicted Marie Antoinette's reproductive failures as divine punishment for her supposed sexual deviancy and political treachery against French interests. These revolutionary publications created an entire mythology around her body, the cornets. The pamphlet writers understood instinctively that attacking a woman's reproductive capacity struck at the very foundation of her social value in 18th century Europe, making Marie Antoinette's medical struggles into weapons that could be used to undermine royal authority itself to Jacques-Pierre Brissot, one of the Revolution's most skilled propagandists, wrote extensively of Brissot, one of the relicized woe of tyranny, arguing court physicians found themselves in the impossible position of trying to defend their medical management of the Queen's fertility, while revolutionary writers twisted every detail of her reproductive health into evidence of aristocratic degeneracy and Habsburg contamination of French purity. The Queen's successful pregnancy in 1778, which finally produced a healthy daughter, was immediately attacked by pamphlet writers who questioned the child's paternity. Marie Thérèse, Charlotte's birth, rather than vindicating the Queen's fertility, became the starting point for even more vicious attacks that portrayed successful royal reproduction as evidence of sexual promiscuity, rather than marital duty fulfilled. Revolutionary propagandists created that Marie Antoinette's pregnancy losses were actually 6 full births that produced deformed monsters, where Raphael's secret killed to prevent the French poor monsters, which were then secret killed. These pamphlets circulated with titles like The Monster Births of Versailles and What the Queen's Doctors Don't Want You to Know, combining medical misinformation with political propaganda to create a toxic mythology around royal reproduction. Scholars debate whether these attacks on Marie Antoinette's reproductive capacity represented genuine political criticism or simply reflected deeper cultural anxieties about female sexuality and foreign influence during as the pornographic pamphlets that began appearing in the mid-1780s took the politicization of the Queen's body to even more extreme levels, featuring explicit illustrations that depicted her engaging in various sexual acts while her reproductive failures were attributed to divine punished for her supposed passion to define porrit. These publications created a feedback loop of public hatred that made Marie Antoinette's every pregnancy a matter of intense scrutiny, with Parisian crowds literally gathering outside Versailles during her labor pains to await news that they could interpret, according to their existing prejudice, the birth of the long-awaited Dauphin Louis. Joseph's triumph for the Queen's reproductive in 1781 should have represented triumph for the Queen's Joseph. In 1781, Schickley represented triumph. Even successful royal reproduction became evidence of royal corruption in the hands of skilled propagandists who understood that attacking Marie Antoinette's maternal capacity was the most effective way to undermine her political legitimacy. The Queen's letters during this period reveal a woman who had begun to understand that her reproductive successes and failures would be weaponized against her regardless of their actual medical or political significance. Her pregnancy with the future Louis Expli in 1785 occurred against a backdrop of revolutionary ferment that made every aspect of royal reproduction a potential source of political controversy and public outrage. Court physicians found themselves walking a tightrope between providing any procedures or treatments that could be misinterpreted by revolutionary writers as evidence of royal excess or foreign medical The elaborate protocols that had once been designed to optimize Marie Antoinette's fertility now served primarily to protect court officials from accusations that they were wasting public resources on foreign royal reproduction, while French citizens struggled with poverty and hunger. Marie Antoinette's final pregnancy in 1786 produced Princess Sophie, who lived only 11 months, so tragedy that revolutionary pamphlets the royal bloodline as punishment for aristocracy. The death of the infant princess became the subject of conspiracy theories, suggesting that the child had been murdered by court physicians to prevent her from revealing physical deformities that would expose the genetic corruption of the Habsburg-Bourbon Union. By the late 1780s, Marie Antoinette's reproducticized that her ability to bear children was viewed by many French citizens as a threat to national pride. As the Queen, who had once been valued primarily for her fertility, found herself in the paradoxical position of being hated for the very reproductive capacity that had originally justified her presence on the French throne. Revolutionary writers had successfully transformed the narrative around royal reproduction from a celebration of dynastic continuity into an indictment of foreign contamination and aristocratic expenia. Marie Antoinette's body had become a battlefield where competing visions of French identity, political legitimacy, and social organization fought for dominance, with her personal reproductive experiences serving as weapons in a larger war about the future of the French nation. The young woman who had once believed that successful pregnancy would earn her acceptance from her adopted country discovered instead that motherhood had made her a target for revolutionary hatred. The woman who had once believed that separate. Yet even as political storms gathered around her reproductive legacy, Marie Antoinette continued to fulfill her maternal duties with the same mechanical precision that had once characterized her fertility treatments, unaware that each pregnancy was adding fuel to the revolutionary fire that would soon consume the world she knew. The revolution that erupted in 1789 transformed Marie Antoinette's role as France's baby machine from a reproductive duty into a death sentence. As the very fertility that had once justified her presence on the French throne became evidence of her crimes against the nation, the revolutionaries who stormed Versailles in October 1789 weren't just attacking the monarchy, they were symbolically destroying the entire system that had reduced a queen to her bicycle system. Marie Antoinette's final years were haunted by the irony that her success as a royal breeding machine had produced the very heirs whose existence now made her too dangerous to live. As revolutionary tribunals declared, the royal children represented permanent. The young Dauphin Louis Joseph's death from tuberculosis in 1789 was simultaneously the merciful death for Marie Antoinette and a political relief for Joseph's death from Marie Antoinette and a political relief. Her surviving son, the future Louis XII, became both her greatest source of maternal pride and her most damning piece of evidence in the revolutionary courts that would ultimately condemn her to death for the crime of having successfully fulfilled her reproductive obligations. The trial proceedings that began in 1790's pregnancies with revolutionary prosecutors are Marie Antoinette's pregnancy. Prosecutor Antoine Fouquier-Tinville dedicated significant portions of his closing arguments to what he called the reproductive crimes of the Austrian woman, claiming that her 16 pregnancies represented a Habsburg blood and destroy French genetic purity. The Revolutionary Tribunal heard detailed testimony about the costs of Marie Antoinette's medical care during her numerous pregnancies, with witnesses calculating that Dr. Martiard, the physician who had once carefully managed the Queen's reproductive schedule, found himself testifying before revolutionary courts about the elaborate medical apparatus that had surrounded royal pregnancy, inadvertently providing evidence. The same fertility calendar that had once been a symbol of scientific precision, the same fertility case of Politicization, Versailles, price. Marie Antoinette's letters to her mother about her reproductive struggles were read aloud in court as evidence of her continuing loyalty to Austria and her fundamental inability to become genuinely French despite 2 decades of residence in France. Revolutionary prosecutors. The political transformation of her reproductive history reached its logical conclusion when revolutionary officials declared that Marie Antoinette's capacity to bear children made her an existential threat to the new republic, regardless of her current political activities or stated intentions. Scholars continue to debate whether the revolutionary focus on Marie Antoinette's fertility just symbiote genuine to definiting a figure of her Kamatsuminia with a Neriam Porcus. The Queen's final imprisonment in the Temple Tower included careful monitoring of her physical condition to ensure that she wasn't pregnant, as revolutionary officials feared that a final royal pregnancy might complicate their plans for her execution. Marie Antoinette's last menstrual cycle, officially ending the reproductive capacity that had once been her primary value to the French state, and removing the final biological obstacle to her execution. The trial testimony revealed the court physicians had maintained detailed records of every aspect of her reproductive health throughout her reign, creating an archive of intimate medical information that revolutionaries used to construct their case for her fundamental unfitness to exist. In the final 16th of October, 1793, to Ricket ceased, Semintation on the 16th of October, 1793, the Reps Day. The crowd that gathered to witness Marie Antoinette's death included many who had read the revolutionary pamphlets attacking her fertility, making her execution a symbolic end to the entire system that had reduced royal women to their reproductive capacity. Revolutionary officials immediately ordered the destruction of the medical records documenting her pregnancies and fertility treatment. The fate of her surviving children became the final chapter in the story of royal reproduction as a political weapon, with young Louis Exploit dying in revolutionary custody, while Mary Therese Charlotte survived to carry the genetic legacy that her mother's reproductive struggles had been designed to preserve. The irony of Marie Antoinette's destruction was that she had fulfilled her original role as a royal baby machine with remarkable success, producing 4 children who survived in royal baby machine with Romagna, yet that very success made her elimination necessary for a revolutionary movement that understood intuitively that the biological foundations of royal authority had to be completely destroyed before a republican government could truly take root. The woman who had once been valued exclusively for her uterus was ultimately killed because that same reproduction, but her own suffering, had helped to inspire. Marie Antoinette's legacy as France's baby machine queen reveals the fundamental contradiction at the heart of royal reproduction. The very fertility that justified a queen's existence could ultimately become the reason for her destruction. When political circumstances changed, her story serves as a reminder that reducing women to their biological functions, even in service of seeming legitimate political goals, creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited by anyone. In the end, Marie Antoinette discovered that being an efficient royal breeding machine offered no protection against the revolutionary forces that her own reproductive struggles had inadvertently helped to unleash. The Austrian teenager, who had arrived at Versailles to serve as a living symbol of Franco-Austrian alliance, died as a middle-aged woman whose fertility had become a symbol of everything the French people wanted to destroy about their aristocratic past. And so the baby machine queen of France found her final rest not in the elaborate royal tombs designed for successful mothers of dynasties, but in the unmarked revolutionary graves reserved for enemies of the people whose greatest crime had been fulfilling the reproductive duties that their society had demanded of them. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the gentle darkness carry away these heavy thoughts of political machinery and human sacrifice. Think, instead of quieter moments in history, when women's stories were written in their own words rather than in the medical charts and revolutionary pamphlets of men who saw them only as threats to be managed or enemies to be destroyed. Let your dreams wander to gardens where children play without the weight of dynasties on their shoulders, and where mothers love their babies simply for being alive, rather than for the political purposes they might serve. Sleep well knowing that the storms of revolution have passed into history, leaving only the gentle whisper of pages turning in archives where Marie Antoinette's story waits to be understood with compassion, rather than judgment. Rest peacefully, while the night settles around you like a soft blanket, protecting your dreams from the harsh realities of ages past, where even motherhood could become a weapon in the endless human struggle for power and justice.